how state debt turns citizens into collateral. We unpack the hidden mechanics shaping our economies and societies across the centuries. Today, I want to walk you through the long arc of how borrowing by states transformed from something occasional and personal into a vast, rolling system of national debt that leans more and more on taxes, current ones and those yet to be collected down the line. We'll trace it from ancient roots right up to the pressures we're seeing now and likely will face tomorrow, focusing on the pure logic of incentives, power, and time. Picture this for a moment. Governments need massive funds for big endeavors like defending borders or building infrastructure, so they borrow instead of raising taxes sky-high right away. It spreads the cost, keeps things stable in the short run, and lets the state act decisively when it matters. On paper, it looks like a clever tool for smoothing out bumps in history, wars, crises, expansions. But as we'll explore, this setup quietly weaves future obligations into the fabric of everyday life, creating a web where today's choices bind tomorrow's citizens in ways they never agreed to. It feels efficient, almost inevitable, yet it raises profound questions about consent, sustainability, and the balance of power between those who lend, those who govern, and those who ultimately foot the bill through their daily labor. Before we dive deeper, if this exploration of state debt and generational chains stirs something powerful in you, hit like, drop a comment, share it wide, and follow for more eye-opening episodes. Now let's pull back the curtain on how this all unfolded and why it leads to a dynamic where future taxes can feel like a form of ongoing obligation that limits freedom. The roots go way back, think temple loans in ancient Sumer and Egypt, or borrowing by Greek city-states for wars and public works. Those were usually short-term deals, secured by specific revenues, jewels, or the ruler's personal word. Defaults happened often, fixed by debasing currency or outright repudiation, but there was no permanent machinery tying broad tax revenues across generations to interest payments. Creditworthiness depended on the borrower's reputation alone, which kept amounts limited and rates high. The first true funded public debt systems emerged in the merchant republics of Renaissance Italy. In Venice as early as 1262, authorities created the Monte Vecchio, a pioneering institution that converted forced and voluntary loans into long-term interest-bearing shares backed by dedicated taxes on trade, salt, and customs duties. This allowed the Republic to finance naval power and expansion while giving lenders a stake in ongoing revenues. Genoa followed suit in 1404 with the Cassa di San Giorgio, a powerful semi-independent bank that consolidated the city's fragmented debts, managed tax collection, and even influenced governance to protect creditor interests. These early experiments showed how institutions could turn one-time borrowing into perpetual obligations secured by future taxes. The decisive pivot to the modern state debt system came in the late 17th century during a time of intense conflict and constitutional upheaval. Following the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which strengthened legislative oversight of budgets and taxation, a government facing enormous war costs struck a historic deal with a syndicate of merchants. In 1694, through the Tonnage Act, they lent £1.2 million at 8% annual interest, plus a management fee, in exchange for a royal charter creating a central banking institution. Parliament explicitly pledged specific new taxes on tonnage duties, beer, ale, and other excises as ironclad collateral for the interest payments. The principle was never intended for quick repayment. Instead, it became a rolling, effectively perpetual obligation. This funded debt model slashed borrowing costs by replacing the ruler's shaky personal credit with reliable tax streams. The system rapidly expanded through new institutions. By 1711, the South Sea Company was chartered to convert floating short-term debts into long-term company stock, swapping government liabilities for equity tied to trade monopolies. The 1720 events around that company highlighted both the risks and the resilience of debt conversion mechanisms. By the mid-18th century, the introduction of consols, consolidated perpetual annuities, allowed the state to maintain massive debt levels indefinitely, servicing only interest while rolling over principal through fresh borrowing. Charter trading companies like the East India Company further served as vehicles for debt management and colonial financing, channeling tax revenues from distant places into interest payments back home. Tax smoothing became the norm. Instead of brutal one-time hikes or currency debasement, moderate ongoing taxes funded endless interest, enabling larger, longer conflicts and infrastructure projects without immediate fiscal collapse. Into the 19th and 20th centuries, the template spread and matured. Major wars and later expansions into public works, welfare programs, and economic stabilization pushed debt higher still, financed through general obligation bonds backed by the full taxing power of the state. Post-crisis periods saw temporary reductions via growth and financial tools, but the core logic persisted. Borrow now, pledge future revenues, roll over forever. Central banking institutions evolved to hold large portions of this debt. Yet the ultimate collateral remained the state's ability to extract taxes across generations. Here's where the logic turns sharper and reveals the potential for citizens to find themselves in a kind of structural bind. When a state pledges future tax revenues as collateral through these institutions and mechanisms, it's not just shifting costs. It's creating an obligation on people who had no voice in the original decision. A child born today inherits a share of the interest burden from borrowings made centuries earlier, paid through taxes on their future earnings, productivity, and consumption. Unlike a voluntary personal loan where you alone bear the consequences, this is imposed collectively through the coercive power of taxation. In pure reasoning terms, it's involuntary servitude. Your labor is partly earmarked to service someone else's past choices, with the state enforcing collection via law. Scale that across generations, and future taxes start to resemble a chain, each cohort working to cover compound interest on debts that keep rolling forward because full repayment is rare. The math of compounding makes it self-reinforcing. Even modest rates, applied to ever larger principles through rollovers, demand steadily rising revenues just to stay current. If economic growth doesn't outpace it, budgets get squeezed, forcing either higher taxes, cuts elsewhere, or more borrowing, which adds yet more interest layers. This dynamic doesn't stop at mere burden. It sets up a powerful alignment between the state and its lenders that protects the entire arrangement. Lenders, whether early merchant syndicates in Venice and Genoa, the 1694 banking charter holders, or later bondholders through the South Sea Company and consols, don't lend blindly. They price in the state's ability to extract taxes reliably over time through institutions designed for that very purpose. Their returns, especially with compound interest baked in, depend on the government maintaining strong fiscal authority. The monopoly on legitimate force to collect revenues, enforce contracts, and prioritize debt service, even when it means tough choices for citizens. In incentive terms, creditors have every reason to back policies and institutions that safeguard this repayment machinery. If the state weakens its taxing power or lets plunder, excessive extraction for other ends, erode the tax base, lenders risk default or restructuring losses. So they naturally gravitate towards supporting a robust, authority-oriented framework where debt obligations come first. This creates a symbiotic loop. The state gains cheap, sustained credit to expand its reach through places and institutions built for perpetual financing, while lenders gain security and influence that helps perpetuate the very system of taxation that funds their interest. The plunder aspect, higher or more intrusive taxes to feed the debt machine, gets shielded because undermining it would hurt the creditor's own contracts. It's not conspiracy. It's straightforward self-interest playing out across time. Citizens end up caught in the middle, their productivity collateralized indefinitely, while the debt grows in a way that rewards stability for lenders over outright liberation through surpluses or restraint. Let's dig deeper into the themes here with clear reasoning. First, the intergenerational angle. Without consent mechanisms, debt becomes a form of hidden taxation on the unborn. Public choice logic shows politicians favor borrowing because benefits arrive now, votes, programs, while costs diffuse into the future. Taxpayers today feel only part of the hit, so resistance stays low. But mathematically, if primary deficits persist and interest compounds, the real burden shifts forward exponentially. One generation enjoys spending. The next inherits higher effective tax rates just to cover service. This erodes the free market ideal of voluntary exchange, replacing it with coerced transfers from producers to debt holders. Second, the enslavement parallel isn't rhetorical overreach, it's about economic bondage. In historical debt peonage seen in ancient systems or Renaissance-funded loans, individuals worked indefinitely to service claims. Scaled to society through Monte Vecchio, Casa di San Giorgio, or modern consols, perpetual state debt does the same collectively. Citizens labor under a tax regime where a growing share services interest rather than building personal or communal wealth. Compound interest amplifies this. It turns finite borrowings into potentially infinite obligations unless growth or surpluses intervene, which history shows are hard to sustain amid political pressures. Third, the lender-state symbiosis highlights a tension with pure free market principles. In a voluntary credit market, borrowers and lenders negotiate freely, with default risk disciplining both. But when the borrower is the state wielding coercive tax power through chartered banks and companies, lenders gain a vested interest in that coercion's effectiveness. They may quietly favor authority-oriented policies, strong enforcement, fiscal conservatism on spending but not on debt service, that keep the revenue spigot open. This protects the plunder dynamic. Taxes extracted not for direct public goods but to honor credit contracts first. Over time, it entrenches bigger government financed by debt, where lenders act as indirect guardians of the system's continuity. Crises only accelerate it. More borrowing to stabilize, more future taxes locked in. The result? A state that's both empowered and constrained, citizens who feel the weight of invisible chains, and a financial class whose incentives align with preserving rather than dismantling the debt engine. To bring this home with some resonant thoughts from deeper in the historical record, consider the era when funded debt first took hold in those Italian city-state institutions. Observers at the time noted how pledging revenues through the Monte Vecchio or Casa di San Giorgio transformed borrowing from a ruler's gamble into a machine that could outlast any single lifetime, binding the Commonwealth indefinitely. One line of reasoning from that period put it starkly. Such arrangements risk turning the populace into perpetual servants of accumulated claims, where interest alone consumes the fruits of labor. Fast forward to the 1694 chartered banking deal and the South Sea conversions, and another insight echoes across centuries. Unpayable debts in slow-growth settings inevitably lead back to bondage unless periodically addressed, because exponential growth outstrips linear tax capacity. And on the creditor side, analysts have long observed that bondholders thrive when states maintain ironclad commitment to repayment through consols and tax-secured institutions, even if it means prioritizing contracts over immediate citizen relief. These aren't isolated quips. They're the distilled logic of how incentives align to sustain the cycle. So where does all this leave us? The recommendation is simple but powerful. Cultivate a sharper awareness of these incentives in every fiscal debate. Push for genuine surpluses when possible, favor spending restraint that avoids locking in future obligations, and question setups where debt service crowds out everything else. In a free market spirit, emphasize voluntary mechanisms and limited government reach to break the compounding trap before it tightens further. Citizens thrive when productivity serves their own ends, not an endless interest ledger. Think critically, discuss openly, and recognize that understanding the system's logic is the first step towards steering it toward balance rather than bondage. Before we dive deeper, if this exploration of state debt and generational chains stirs something powerful in you, hit like, drop a comment, share it wide, and follow for more eye-opening episodes. Keep questioning the structures that shape our tomorrows because they started forming long ago. Stay untaxed, stay free,